Another season, another batch of animes I had to watch. Now let's see how this fares up to the previous season. Oh shit, I missed the season. Sorry about that. Once again, my inconsistent schedule strikes back. I'll have to talk about it at the end of the video, but before we proceed to this season's list, here's a list of animes I would have put for last season. Anyway, on to winter, and man oh man, this season just keeps on giving. As per usual, winter has some absolute bangers I can't wait to show to you guys. From the hype stuff, to the chill stuff, to the stuff you didn't expect to be good, and the stuff you expected to be better. Here is my list of animes I've seen in winter, because if I finished it, should you? As always, this will be ranked by most recommended to least recommended. Anyway,
let's go!
Coming off first, my most recommended show for this season is Attack on Titan Season 4 Part 2. To no one's surprise, of course, Attack on Titan has been a monumental show since its first episode aired, and this entry does not change that at all. Before I talk about the show, as a way of not spoiling anything visually because this season is just full of heavy stuff right from the get-go, I'll instead put some Risk of Rain 2 gameplay while inserting a few vague shots here and there. So don't worry if you haven't seen any of it, which is pretty weird. Now let me talk about AOT the Final Season Part 2. And if you've been on the net recently, you could probably change the title to an Evangelion film because this is not the final season. Kinda. There's gonna be a Final Season Part 3, Thrice Upon a Time, next year. So if you're waiting for the entire final season to be animated, there's your heads up. Anyway, this season was absolutely bonkers. For those who've seen the previous season, you all saw the cliffhanger this story brought. And oh boy does it absolutely deliver. Final Season Part 1 was definitely a build-up to what this is, a war. And the first thing I want to point out about this season is how well they captured this entire war arc. I think I should have prefaced as well that I have read the manga, so a lot of this critique might come off as a total nitpick, but I'll try to be as objective as possible. Not. But yeah, they captured the war arc so well in this season. The bloodshed and chaos that was in the manga had been elevated in this anime. What I love that they did here that I haven't seen that much in other anime was actually capture war in its horrible form. It is bloody, people are dying everywhere, and there's just no heroes or villains. And what made it even more nuanced is that you've seen both perspectives. You know where both sides are coming from. And there's always this theme they like to show you that war is bad. And it might sound like an absolute no-brainer with how simple that theme is, but the show does it does its best at capturing a war where it's never just black and white and you don't entirely root for one side. And in terms of plot, I will say, in my humble opinion, that this season is the best in the story. In fact, it is the best parts of the manga that they adapted. It has a lot of payoff, a lot of questions answered, and a lot of unexpected tie-ins to threads back in the previous seasons. And when I say it ties in alright. You're gonna lose your nuts at the twists and revelations they reveal. I can talk about characters, but that would be getting into spoilers, so I'll just say that the characters in this season are a far cry to when you first met them in Season 1. And despite the action-packed scenes that this show is gonna grab you on, the highlights of the show are the personal conflicts each character has to go through. Everyone has a character arc this season. And the last thing I want to talk about is the animation. Of course, I can't just leave out the one crucial part I'd like to critique, because I was one of those people who got underwhelmed with the action of the previous season. I will admit, this was mainly due to the switching of studios and noticing a different visual style to what we've seen before. And no, it wasn't the CGI mainly. For the most part, I was on board with the Titan CGI. It really was more of the visual direction of the action scenes and how rough some of it seemed. Like, there were scenes where you'd notice that they had to cut corners for this particular shot, and this leads me to this season, where they absolutely improved on that. First of all, I'm gonna give another one of my humble, not so hot opinions. But this season of Attack on Titan probably has the best CGI characters in anime that really fit with the style. Because you've seen animes like Beastars or Land of the Lustrous, which are both great CGI animes in their own rights. But think about mixing those 3D models with 2D versions of that, and I think Beastars actually did that. You know what, I just remembered. but honestly, AOT tops it by a slight margin. The CG Titans here are absolutely detailed, and the blending with the 2D style of animation works tremendously. So in short, this is a masterpiece of a season, part of a masterpiece series that I highly recommend. For the negatives of the show, I honestly couldn't find any, except for a few nitpicks as a manga reader, but other than that, this is a spectacular show. You know, I feel like I should have just made a separate video for Attack on Titan, but I don't got time for that. We're moving on to my next most recommended show of this season, which is, of course, The Case Study of Vanitas Part 2, not Season 2. Keep that in mind. Now, if you haven't seen the first season, don't worry, I won't be putting out spoilers here as well. If anything, I hope what I say here compels you to go and watch the series as a whole, as it is a very, very good watch. The Case Study of Vanitas, an introduction for those unfamiliar, is essentially a 19th century buddy cop vampire show that has some amazing characters and an even more amazing presentation. Now, to reiterate some things I said back when I talked about the first core of the show, I described the anime as polished. And that sounds pretty vague, until you watch the show, and then you'll know exactly what I'm saying. Even I forgot about this when I started the second part, until a scene like this comes along and just surprises you with its amazing presentation. I have never seen a director handle quick cuts much like Tomoyuki Itamura. This man knows how to pace a scene, how to make it build tension and fear, and just properly portray certain character thoughts and emotion just from the fast cuts and the great framing. And then add the soundtrack in each episode, and it all just sums up into this near masterpiece of a show. Of course, I have to give credit to the author of the manga as well. Which, by the way, going off on a bit of a tangent, I initially thought this show was based off a light novel. I mean, the story and dialogue just screams light novel. Normally when something is so plot-focused and dialogue-heavy, you'd think it was from a light novel, but to my surprise, it was from a manga. How this author did it, I don't know. An absolute beast. But yeah, the story is good and it gets better this second time around, with a new arc. The first part definitely felt like an introduction to this world, these characters, their goals, and the villains. So it gets you hooked, but it doesn't really start to move until this season, where it really starts to move. It answers a lot of questions I had in the first part, whilst just adding more. Which makes me sad because from what I've heard, they basically caught up with the manga, or that there's not enough material for another season. And because I said that, I'm reminded by it. And I'm now sad again. But yeah, it moves its plot forward and tells it in such a beautiful way. You know how shonen mangas most of the time do an arc that raises some stake for the character but not necessarily helps them in any direct way. Instead, it only helps them take a step to their goal. That's normally how shonen arcs work, but what I've noticed in Vanitas is that it starts off as just another normal arc that may seem like there's nothing to do with the characters until it has something big to do with the characters. Like, I thought the arc adapted in this part was just phenomenal. And going back to pacing, because this really impressed me when I watched it, but I'm not the biggest fan of flashbacks. Not in the non-linear type of way, like the flashbacks where before a character reaches their goal, they decide to halt the plot and show some backstory to presumably enhance or give context to the character's motivation, but in the end it actually ends up ruining the pace of the scene. Well yeah, Vanitas does that, but not once was I bored of the flashback. In fact, I was just as engaged in the flashbacks as I am in the present. The people behind this were probably on some weird black magic shit to pull up this sort of perfect blending of flashbacks and present plot. It is simply astounding. Now, I remember saying that the first part of this season built up this world that I just wanted to learn more about. I was a bit wrong on that, so let me rephrase it. I think the world of Vanitas has some really interesting characters that I want our main protagonist to meet. Every character I saw was either likable, interesting, sympathetic, or all of the above. It is pure insanity that this author manages to make such likable characters, or ally or villains, who all have their own goals. It's not always I'm here to help the MC progress the story. It's all more complex than that. And the art is good. Props to the entire animation team, especially the background artist. And oh, let me try this. How about I just show a montage of the art and a bit of the animation? You can see for yourself.
18世紀ここジェボーダン地方で100名以上の女子供を無残に切り裂いたベート
You like? Anyway, the case study of Vanitas, I hope we get another season. But I'm gonna have to wait for it for like 10 years at least. But that doesn't stop me from telling you guys that this show is a must watch. And possibly a potential masterpiece if it continues. Alright, 86 Part 2. Now, this is gonna be a more difficult anime for me to talk about, mainly because of the months between the last few episodes. This was due to some really difficult production problems. And the last time I saw an anime have a long break due to some production problems, let's just say it didn't end well. But alas, here we are. So, was this anime any good at all? Hell yeah, it was amazing. Talking about this series as a whole, including the first part, it is simply epic. Before I talk about this second part, let me brief you with the first part in case you haven't seen it yet. 86 is about an empire that's trying to fend off this horde of seemingly more intelligent soldiers from another nation. But this empire has, surprise surprise, a little bit of racism. They essentially use the aliens. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong story. They use these group of people they call the 86. Which, for the life of me, I forgot why they call them that. But I'm sure they mention it in the first few episodes. But yeah, these people are heavily looked down upon and are treated as nothing but expendable weapons for war. And then, surprise surprise, one of the commanders in the Empire thinks differently. She thinks that racism is bad? No shot. Okay, that sounded really condescending, I know, but despite that, the show is genuinely good. The first part was an absolute highlight of the season when it finished airing, and now we have a second part which I was hoping it would live up to the same hype as the first one. Unfortunately, it does not. Now this doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, so let me explain. 86 Part 2, not Season 2, takes a different turn in its story compared to the first part. Where the first part had a lot to do with perspectives and seeing both sides of the empire, Part 2 only focuses on one side this time, and it deals more with just the characters' inner turmoil of trying to fit in a society they think they don't belong in. We have a bunch of characters who are just torn up from this war, and having them in this environment where it's all peaceful, it just doesn't sit well with them. Why I say that this part doesn't live up to the hype of the first one is mainly due to the fact that it follows a more character study type of story. But to their credit, they really do develop these characters to be better, more of a family. And after what they've been through in the first part, here the bonds feel strong. Not just the bonds between the characters, but the bonds between the audience with the characters. You'll feel a sense of satisfaction for these characters as they're finally able to attain some peace outside the battlefield. But you'll soon find out that our characters are the ones who aren't satisfied with this. And speaking of characters, we get introduced to a bunch of new ones, most notably Ernst and Frederica. I won't spoil their entire roles to the story, but I'd like to say that they were a nice addition to our cast, and their relationship with our original members felt just as genuine. First, we have Ernst, who's just such a fun character. He felt like this stepdad who wasn't really sure how to connect with his kids, yet he was still as accepting and as protective as a real parent. Then we have Frederica, who I have no idea how they were gonna fit her into the plot other than to be a mascot, but yeah, her arc had some really good moments, and her development with our original characters, especially Shin, was really heartwarming in the end. And yeah, there's still a lot of war scenes, a lot of mecha spider fights, and I'll have to be honest, it didn't get me as pumped as it did in the first season. And it's not due to any lack of quality with the animation. I think just based on the context, the fights just felt like normal fights compared to the first part where there were stories and character arcs developing as the fights were unfolding. And there are some moments like that here. It's just that it does feel like they're doing the same thing as the first part, so it loses a bit of its intrigue when it's happening. Well, let's talk about the pacing, because this show slows down. In 86 Part 1, we meet our crew and they're this bunch of soldiers who you'd think they were just born in the battlefield with how they fight. But here in the second part, they put our characters back down to a starting point and they have to slowly go their way back to the top again to fight the final enemy. So in a way, it's definitely a slow burner. But my god, does this have such a satisfying ending. Holy shit. And I think that's what the show was always trying to achieve. Just this slow rise to this climactic finale, which was honestly rightfully deserved. And now I just want to see more of it. I definitely want to see where this story goes from here on, and I bet you would too if you saw this, so go give it a watch.
いいの？
はい。
マジ？
はい。
Next up is My Dress Up Darling. Oh boy, it's the best girl of the season. Can't wait to talk about this and how overrated it is. Whoa. Did I just say a hot take? Okay, before y'all put up your pitchforks, what is this show about? Well, simply put, it's a high school slice of life rom-com about a gyaru who wants to cosplay and a boy who's pretty good at sewing. Now to go back to my hot take, I want to say that I really wanted to hate this show. Like, I'm very much a pathetic hipster when it comes to shows that get too much traction, but even then I try to keep my reviews objective. But this show was just genuinely good, even for me. I really went into this show going, alright, who's this Marin girl? This new kid thinks she's hot shit? We'll see about that. But by the end of the series, I was just curled up like a ball, compressing from all the wholesomeness of this show. Our two main characters are always a treat to see. Marin, who on surface view might just be your typical gyaru, is actually more than that when you start watching the show. Surprise, surprise, the character is actually not what they seem, but no. It's not just that. What's so special about Marin is that she's a gyaru who's also an otaku, but is not afraid to show that side of her. She's not afraid to put a keychain of her favorite character on her bag, where in her society it could be something of a bold move to do. And she likes to cosplay. That's a fucking plus. Thinking about it now, I'm not sure she falls into the typical dere archetypes. She's very energetic and teasing like your typical anime girl, but she has moments where she feels like a normal human being who has hobbies she really cares about. And then we have Gojo, and here, I'm gonna put out an actual hot take, for real this time. I think Gojo was a better character than Marin in this show. What's so refreshing about Gojo is that he's a really interesting character that acts like a normal human being, but is not boring at all. He's just this guy who has always been afraid to show people what he likes, just because of a past experience. And when he met Marin, it's like he saw a reflection of him who wasn't afraid to put it out there. So having Marin help Gojo's character made him a much more interesting character. And you could say it's unfair because Gojo is inherently the main protagonist, but if you think about it, even most male protagonists in romance stories are the most dense motherfucker to come out. And with all these situations happening in the show, the character arcs do a little back and forth in their development, where we'll see Gojo helping Marin out, and then this helps his passion for creating things further refine. But on the other hand, Marin also gets more passionate about cosplaying and they just keep rubbing off each other throughout the show. And I didn't mean that in a sexual way. Well, I might have. Just a little. But you will start to see how they develop their characters and even their feelings for each other in such an organic way. And yes, this is a rom-com, so a lot of situations involve the squeezing of your heart due to the wholesomeness of the show. Like I said, they developed their characters so naturally that by the end of the season, I was really satisfied with where they were at with their relationship. And oh yeah, I forgot to mention, the show is definitely ecchi, so you know, should have put it at the start, but now that I'm thinking about it, yeah, I should have put it at the start. But yeah, if that turns you off, it turns some people on. I don't know what to say. Honestly, I think it complements it well with the comedic situation, but the animators knew what they were doing. There is some genuine tension even in some scenes, but yeah, specifically with the context that cosplaying is very rooted in otaku culture, and otaku culture is quite associated with, well, culture. I think it was nice. I mean, generally it doesn't faze me. But moving on to the side characters, we do get a few. I can probably only talk about two, which are Sajuna and Shinju. They're sisters who are also into cosplaying. I thought they were fine. We get some character arcs with each of them, and they were quite nice as well. But I can't really say I've seen them in enough episodes to actually connect with their character. But it did make me want to see more of them. Perhaps in season 2? Cloverworks? Overall, My Dress Up Darling is definitely one of my favorite rom-coms. Not just this season, but in general. A really good adaptation, just filled with fun scenes that can sometimes be a bit endearing. You know what? Very endearing. Yeah, go watch it.
私は新しい学校で
Next up is Akebi's Sailor Uniform. Well, how should I describe this anime? I guess it's simply cute girls doing cute things. But it does that to an extreme degree. Like literally. Watching an episode of this is like downing a pint of sugar every time a character smiles. So you do the math. Okay, well, if you want more details, Akebi's Sailor Uniform is about a girl named, well, Akebi, who just recently reached middle school and is enrolled in this, I think, prestigious all-girls middle school. It's honestly not that important. What's important is that she's really into sailor uniforms. Like, really into it. So her mom made her one. But turns out the school doesn't really use sailor uniforms for their students anymore. But the school made an exception. Because it's Akebi. I mean, just look at that smile. And the entire show is just about Akebi-chan making new friends while being the best she can be in school. It's really just a feel-good show, but goddamn does it make me feel good every time I watch an episode. I can say that this slice of life anime is not unique by any means, but it does everything a slice of life should do. This anime is adapting a manga from the same author as Super Cup. Now if y'all remember that anime, that was also a very slice of life show. But I think wherever that anime failed, this anime definitely improved upon. Just from the individual stories to the characters and obviously the visuals, Akebi's Sailor Uniform is just gorgeous to look at. I was referring to both. Every episode is just Akebi trying to make friends with a new classmate. Kinda like Komi-san, now that I think about it. The premise is actually like Komi-san, with a glaring opposite in their personalities, of course. Where Komi-san was essentially an introvert and has communication problems, Akebi is the complete opposite, being the most extroverted thing in the world. The type of person I essentially would be afraid to meet. And an interesting thing I've noticed from this show, or maybe just an interesting thing I've realized about myself, is how the story paints this world in the eyes of an innocent mind. One big point to, point out is Akebi, someone who's so unrealistically cheerful, and someone who can only exist in that world that the author has made. And even the personality of the classmates borders so much in this fantasy-like world, like it's from a child's imagination. It's not a coming-of-age story one might essentially relate to realistically. It feels more like a fairy tale or a children's book, essentially showing this colorful world that the author of the manga has thought of, glorifying the theme of youthful innocence. Or it might just be me realizing how jaded I've become. Because if you think about it, if Komichi was in this real world, she'd be the type to be bullied by her classmates as being an attention seeker or an obnoxious person. But it works here because this world is just so pure. And the animators did their absolute best in trying to visualize that here. Like, how many of you were not able to see your kids because you were stuck animating a girl opening a door? I salute the people making this show, and I hope we get more shows like these, not just for shonen, just some shows that showcase talent and make people appreciate the work and the effort put by these animators. While Cloverworks may hit some egregious lows, they hit some outstanding highs, and that's what it's been for their entries this season. So go definitely watch Akebi-chan, because if not, I'll do it. I'll fucking do it again. Now, before y'all chop my head off for not putting this in number 1, let me just give you one more reason why you should. I just never thought Demon Slayer's narrative as something refreshing. I think Ufotable made an extremely successful attempt at adapting an average shonen into something beyond average, and I could still say the same for this season. Demon Slayer Entertainment District arc is exactly where it is. If you've seen the previous arc, which was the Infinity Train one, which also had a TV release, let me just tell you, aside from a few things, the formula is still the same. Tanjiro, Zenitsu, and Inosuke arrive in the entertainment district, They meet a Hashira, they go into some crazy antics, and then they find out that some demon has been haunting that place. It's the same old, same old. In terms of character development, I can't say it's any different from the previous one. The first episode has some really good character moments with Tanjiro, and we're still drip-fed clues about his father. The characters that stand out the most are mostly the new Hashira and the villains, but this is mainly because we find out about their backstories in this arc. I will say, the villains had some good backstory, definitely way better than the one in Infinity Train. And of course, I'd be lying if I said that I didn't enjoy just the trio getting into all sorts of trouble. Of course it was fun. I'm just trying to piss people off because this show is getting too much hype. No, I'm joking. I mean, honestly, the animation in this one was bonkers. Not sure if it's just because of the setting, but the action scenes here just looked so amazing and much more visually stimulating than the other ones. The final fight is just a French kiss. Wait, no. A chef's kiss, not a French. Could very well be just a French kiss. Other than that, I'm not sure what to say. Of course, I definitely recommend this show, and despite it possibly reusing the same old formula again and again for future seasons, I'll still happily tune into it. But that's all I could say for this show. I mean, yeah, go watch it.
金持ちがチーズバーガーのピクルスをそこいらの犬に投げて越にいるようなジーマガイの遊びに過ぎない。
Well, next on the list we have Sabikui Bisco, an anime I thought had the potential of being my favorite of the season. If I were to describe Sabikui Bisco, it's pretty much like Mad Max, a post-apocalyptic Japan infested with rust caused by this enormous entity that blasted the land some years ago. Then there are these mushroom hunters who are believed to be the cause of rust and are feared by a lot of people. Until one fateful encounter with a mushroom hunter, Panda, our main protagonist, tags along in this journey of finding a certain mushroom that might just help them in their situation. Now, why I said this anime had the potential to be my favorite is that it has such an amazing first episode, and then it continues to rise up until the latter half of this season where it sort of plateaus, and that's when it lost me out of its hype. But that's not to say that this wasn't a solid show, because it certainly is. From what I've heard, the latter half of the show was adapting an arc that wasn't that long in the novel and could have been cut shorter in the anime, and I definitely agree with that. A lot of my problems lie with how the last few episodes were paced, but I understand if it had something to do with adapting the novel to a certain point within a 12 episode length. I mean, it's pretty normal in anime like that. I mean, I'd rather have that than a rushed story. But let me talk about the characters of this show. It is filled with some fun characters that each have their own journey throughout the show, but not necessarily a destination. Our main characters are Akaboshi and Milo, who start off hesitant with each other but form this brotherly bond throughout the show, and it's nice to see that despite looking almost like a one-note character in the show, they do have certain qualities that make them pass as a decently written character. Like, take Akaboshi for example, who could easily be put into the archetype of that loud and angry character. I mean, he literally looks like that rock dude from My Hero. But throughout the show, we see how well he can handle himself in the outside world and how being a hunter taught him some cunning techniques when it comes to surviving. Milo, on the other hand, could come off as a typical pacifist bean sprout, kind and pure-hearted, but when it comes to surviving, he's not afraid to get shit done, whilst also taking care of others because he is a doctor. And throughout Akaboshi and Milo's journey, they discover lots of cool sceneries and meet a lot of eccentric people along the way, and these moments are what made me fall in love with the series. A lot of shots in this show are like wallpaper material. Whoever was in charge with the background art needs a raise. They make this post-apocalyptic Japan look so well shot despite the desolate setting. Even the atmosphere is, well, atmospheric. Like when they're next to a campfire all covered up with blankets, just talking about some stuff in their life, it can feel cozy, like you're there with them. And these little moments also build on the relationship between Akaboshi and Milo. So when the story takes a turn and actually focuses on a certain plot, it sort of pulled me out of that atmosphere. I liked it a lot when it was just about the adventure of the week, and that's where most of my complaints about the show are. If I were to discuss about the latter half of the show as an action plot, it's still good. There's still that that bromance the two main characters have. And with the supporting characters also having some moments to shine, I can't really complain much as well. I guess there were just some parts of that arc that I really wished was just cut down. And I also thought the villain to be a little bit boring. I don't know how to explain it. And this is very blasphemous coming from me, an average Sudoken enjoyer. But the writing for his character just didn't really stick with me. Like, he does some despicable stuff in the show, but nothing much to warrant him being a well-written villain. He's just a villain enough to pass the title. The animation in this show, to describe it, is pretty efficient. The staff working on this show knew where to put their frames on and where to save it. And the action, while sometimes you can notice the minimalistic style of the motion, it still has that punch to it, like any good animation has. In some ways, I was reminded of the Trigger animation style, where some scenes can get comically insane and the action just feels very sharp. Now, I'm not sure if this will get a second season, but I certainly hope so, because I want to see more of the world they're going to be exploring. But the anime ends off at a pretty nice point that even a second season isn't needed, so I'd recommend people watch this.
お初にお目にかかる。俺が相馬和也だ。
アミドニア皇王のユリウスだ。
Up next is How a Realist Hero Rebuilt the Kingdom Part 2. An isekai, because you can't last an anime season without them. Thankfully, this was one of the better ones, as I've mentioned in one of my previous videos where I talk about the part 1 of this season. To catch you all up, the plot is literally in the title. It's about a realist guy summoned to another world to help rebuild the kingdom. Now, when I first talked about this show, I described it as a junk food anime, a generic plot, and an okay show where I would rather recommend the source material over. With the second part finished airing, I must say, this part of the season brought up some great arcs that definitely made me love this season more than the last one. Of course, I still think the light novel is way superior, but this show does a great job of keeping you tuned in every week with just some great city building plot and fun characters. I think what makes this show better than the previous season is that it brings out more of Soma's brilliance as the king of this nation. They bring up a lot of interesting ideas and keep you engaged in some political dialogue. For real, there are episodes within this season that are just full-on dialogue, and it's not monogatari type of dialogue. It's more explanatory and direct. And because you clearly understand what they're discussing, it keeps you entertained for most of their talks. When it comes to some ideas, the show also presents its situation as an opportunity to see a kingdom built with the knowledge of what happened with our history in our own world. So things like the American Civil War get referenced here, and clearly Soma knows the mistakes that happened in that history, so he gets a chance to do it in a right way or in a better way. And in that sense, it's a successful attempt at a power fantasy. Soma's character is definitely one of the better isekai protagonists I've seen. He has traits of being earnest when it comes to his job, and it always feels like he has the upper hand. And while it sounds like he's no different from a standard isekai protagonist, I think it's just how his character is presented in the show that makes his normal personality work. This anime definitely has a way of showing stakes without there being any actual stakes. Like, our gang might find themselves in a situation, but in the end, you always know that Soma has a plan up his sleeve. I think that the fact that they executed it so well is already an accomplishment for the show. There were some unexpected development in the plots that caught me off guard in a very fun way. And the last episode was a big reveal for the series. I can't help but ask for more of this show. And despite me not recommending the first part to watch, just because this season is so good, I recommend watching that and then watching this part, because this is definitely going to be in my list of isekais if I were to recommend one.
先日のアースワルド帝国皇帝急逝の知らせを受け、皇宮は権力闘争の真靴と化しているそうです。
The Genius Princess Guide to Raising a Nation Out of Debt is another title that gives away its plot. But surprisingly, this isn't an isekai. It's actually a legitimate fantasy show that has its own built world that our characters are fairly familiar with. Nothing too special because it's almost the same without the reincarnation part, but it's still a plus in my book. But since we all know the plot, what other selling point does this show have? For one, it has some great production quality. The best part of the animation is the character expressions. They did some good work trying to really emphasize character expressions whenever they're being all playful or being serious. The animation captures that. But of course, the animation in general is just well done. It has production quality that makes me wish Realist Hero had the same treatment, which by the way is pretty funny that when I first heard about this show, I thought, how is this different from Realist Hero? I mean, it's both about genius rulers trying to make their respective nations better, but I can say that this anime is a different beast. It's more character focused, and what I mean about that is that you're not really interested in how this prince is trying to save his country, but just how this prince goes about and dealing different situations. You're definitely more interested in the characters than you are with the situation they're in. And speaking of characters, there is a fun cast of characters put into this show, with each arc adding more. The first episode introduces our main protagonist, Prince Wayne, and his attendant, Ninim, and you sort of try to puzzle what exactly is their relationship throughout the show. And while you get a gist of it, you never really get a definite answer. But just seeing their dynamic is enough to just make you like their characters. Wayne is the genius schemer that somehow always has the upper hand in some situations, and he also has to put up this different image when he's with his officers. He has to act all proper and collective. But when he's with Ninim, that's where we really get to see the real side of him that makes you love his character. And Ninim is the super loyal partner of Wayne, who's like the straight edge type of person that counters Wayne's personality, as with a lot of comedic duos. And you know what you might be thinking? Isn't Wayne just Soma from Realist Hero? Well, no. I'm not sure how to describe it, but you'll definitely see big differences if you compare both Soma and Wayne together. And if we're comparing this anime to Realist Hero, I think this anime has way better character writing. Each character has a presence and their dialogues are way more engaging compared to Realist Hero's more entertaining dialogue. The conversations here feel snappy and it does feel like a real conversation. Like, some scenes involve trying to persuade one another into falling into their plans, and you get to see the thought process between these two characters, and while they're talking, you're there trying to figure out what exactly each one is scheming. But this also brings us to the bad sides of the show, because I think the show should have been better than Realist Hero, especially with the production quality it has. But it's when they're talking and you just fail to keep up with their dialogue because it goes too fast. Not literally, more like pacing wise. You get moments where a person mentions this, so you immediately have to analyze what the person meant by that. But by that point, they're already planning this other thing and you become lost in the conversation. And from what I've seen looking around some threads is that this was a rushed adaptation. Again, in terms of pacing, I think they adapted 5 volumes within 12 episodes. And if you compare that to 86 adapting 1 volume for 11 episodes, I think you can see the problem there. At some parts, I can see why they would do that, but that choice ultimately was the detriment of the show. Nonetheless, they adapted 5 volumes into this one solid package of a season, and I don't think we'll be getting another season, so while I recommend to watch this anime just for its craft, if you're really into the story, then I suggest just reading the light novel.
ねえそれ死んでるの
And up next is another isekai. Life with an ordinary guy who reincarnated into a total fantasy knockout. Well, this definitely takes the cake for the longest title of the season, so I'm just gonna call it Fantasy Bishoujo, because it's easier and I'm more familiar with that title. So Fantasy Bishoujo is about 2 best friend co-workers who got isekai'd into this world where they have to defeat the demon lord. Typical isekai stuff. But wait, as they wake up in this other world, one noticed he suddenly received super strength as a power, while the other woke up as a cute girl, whose charm is too powerful that even his best friend can't handle it. Now I think this concept is just a really great thought experiment. Like, what if you and your just think about it, right guys? What if you and your best friend of the same gender, assuming you're straight, get isekai'd into this world, and your best friend becomes the opposite gender and is an anime girl. And just from that premise alone, this show already sets up some great scenarios right from the start. The first few episodes definitely had some great comedic situations where the female protagonist, Tachibana, has to deal with everyone being attracted to her, while our male protagonist, Jinguji, has to deal with the heavy lifting they do, but also trying to resist Tachibana's charms because it works on him as well. It's just a really funny rom-com. Although while it's all funny and all that, the joke sort of gets more and more stale as episodes go by. It's always Tachibana being the cute one, so she just has to hide her face, and Jinguji is always trying to not look at her as to avoid being charmed. But the show tries its best to keep you entertained till the end. And to their credit, they do. It's a real fun show, but all I can say about it is its funny premise, and other than that, I can honestly just put this with all the other generic comedies. This does feel like an average comedy with a gimmick that just lasted for about half a season, but by the end I wouldn't say it was a waste of time. Still, if you're not here to kill some time, then I wouldn't really recommend this show. Otherwise, yeah, it's a pretty okay comedy. The strongest sage with the weakest crest is another isekai again. But seeing as it's at the bottom of our list, I'm sure you all know the reason why. Strongest sage is about, well, take a guess. But essentially the story follows him reincarnating into another life, not necessarily another world, but it's still an isekai. And now that he's the strongest sage in a little boy's body, a power fantasy is made. A generic one, that is. Of course, it's just another trashy isekai that somehow got on my radar. I mean, now that I think about it, how did I get to watch this show? I actually have no clue. But the reason I didn't drop it was simply for the fact that it had a decent production quality. Nothing too extreme, but I was just baffled at how better this looked than Realist Hero. Again, I'm gonna mention it again. But it's nowhere as good in terms of story. Yes, I finished it simply because I was salty, because both shows are made by JC Staff, a studio where I always keep my expectations low, so that things like this can sometimes surprise me. Now, this show does nothing inherently bad. Instead, just imagine an AI writing a script for a power fantasy isekai, and this is what you get. So if you're like really into isekai, like I don't know, a hoarder of those shows, then sure, consume this all you want. But personally, I wouldn't suggest this. Not even as a bad show, but it's just not worth my time, and I honestly regret watching it. And that was all for the things I've watched this winter, late as always, and for some updates on where I've been, same as always, academic mumbo-jumbo that keep hogging up my time. But I'd like to talk more about that in a different video I'll be uploading next week, because this channel has over 300 subs. Thanks a lot to all of you who watch my videos, and stay tuned for that video next week for more updates. Also, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, even if it's a long one. That was an understatement, it's a real long one. In fact, I'm not sure if I should keep it this way, like making more detailed reviews and longer videos, or shorter ones with brief description. I don't know, sometimes I just like to ramble a lot and I end up talking for hours, so that's gonna be hard to work with. But anyways, that's all I have to say for now. See you all in the next video.